A very good afternoon to all our dear participants and a warm welcome to our speaker of the session. I am Mohua from the Department of Sociology and I will be coordinating the post-lunch session today. The first speaker in our post-lunch session is Dr. Debarati Bagchi, Senior Research Fellow and Deputy Director of the Max Weber Forum of South Asian Studies. And the topic of her lecture today is Street Dwelling and City Space, Life and Labor of Women Waste Pickers in Kolkata. Thank you. I warmly welcome Dr. Bagchi and I would request you to start the talk.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible. You are audible now.
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me for this talk. I will present the paper, and this work is, I did this work as a part of a project. I was associated with the Calcutta Research Group and I was part of a project that studied the urban poor. So the city space and urban poor. So this paper was a result of working with other researchers of that project. So this is based on my fieldwork between the years 2014 and 16. So it has been quite some time. But I think particularly over the last month, I felt like the questions that this paper raises have found new significance or could find new significance in the questions that we are now discussing around the Claim the Night movement, around the discourses that are going on in Calcutta right now, women's rights and women's safety, infrastructure, the role of infrastructure. So I think these kind of questions have made the paper's argument, which it was written 8 years back, but it could acquire a new significance in the changed circumstances and the changed rhetoric of the discourse. So basically, this paper will be on what today I will present is on the life stories of waste pickers in a particular location in Calcutta, and their time, territory, their family structures, the nitty-gritties of their occupational like patterns, and try to raise some questions, as I said. So basically the paper locates the migrant women waste pickers among the pavement dwellers and homeless population of a particular area of Kolkata. And it tries to understand the processes and the structures of migration, occupation, life and labor conditions, vulnerabilities, and the question of access to infrastructure and resources among this particular occupation group, the waste pickers. Now, I try to illustrate that the gendered question of waste picking cannot be addressed simply by understanding the act of waste picking. Rather, it has to be seen in conjunction with the spatiality of their dwelling, the space where they lived, the proximity of that space with the spaces where they picked the waste. So the question of space becomes very central to the understanding of their occupational pattern. Now I seek to understand, as I mentioned, the nitty-gritties of time, territory, family structures, pattern of shifts in occupation taking place in and around this particular dwelling area. Put differently, I'm interested in the relationship between the contingencies of occupation and the question of social reproduction, keeping the question of space alive. So the question of space will be very central in understanding this particular occupational group, and also how the gendered notion of space plays out in this kind of a setup. Now, if we like, I traced some of the earlier surveys that first brought this particular occupation group within their fold. So around 73, 74, there was one survey by the Calcutta Metropolitan Planning Organization. Then around 86, 87, there was another survey. So these surveys reflected on the exigencies of rural-urban migration. Their focus was primarily on the rural-urban migration that happened between 1940s and 70s. And all of these surveys emphasize that the southern hinterland of the city, the southern part of the then undivided 24 Parganas, was a major contributor to the pavement dwelling population in the city of Calcutta. Now, when I went back to do this work around 2014, I noticed that most of the particular group of women that I was talking to, they were not recent migrants. They could be actually traced back to this particular time that the surveys were indicating, and they did travel to the city between those decades, like most of them during 1960s, 70s, early 1980s. Now, these surveys also revealed that the income variation within these groups often depended on the proximity of their dwelling places and their workplaces, a factor which definitely impacts the question of access. Now, we shall come back to this point a little later. Later, in 2000s, one in 2012 and 13, another in 2014, there were some more studies that focused, not exactly surveys, but they tried to map the kind of movements and the kind of consolidation that was going on around these particular occupation groups. And Paramita Chakraborty's work is very important there. And there they noticed that the Calcutta Samaritans were working working for organizing slum dwellers, homeless population in Calcutta. They were forming groups in particular wards. Then the Calcutta Nabojagran Mancho was formed. In these platforms, women waste pickers constituted a substantial section. So Paramita Chakraborty and some others who were working during post 2010, they indicated that homeless household, this particular two words, were taken as a unit of enumeration and research more often. Paramita Chakraborty showed that the Kolkata Nabojagran Mancho had been successful in securing many of their the demands of the homeless, and she argued that the homeless movement also helps us to discern how urban poverty and homelessness remains a gendered experience in contemporary cities. So she actually emphasized the gender angle very strongly. And on the one hand, these movements were creating a space for women to voice their demands, and the other, they also reinforced the identification of home with women. Now, while doing this study, I kind of realized that the discourse of homelessness essentially presupposes a right to home. This somehow detaches the question of occupation from the question of dwelling. All waste pickers get clubbed under the umbrella term of homeless. Now, whenever we look at it from the point of view of something lacking, homelessness is essentially a category that is based on the lack of a home. The ethnography, on the other hand, was revealing certain interesting aspects which pushed me to question this category and understand that it was not actually the lack of home which was the singular and the most fundamental problem for this particular occupation group, and particularly for the women. It was basically the homeless status and living on the streets that actually gave them more access to certain other spaces where they based their work. So they could live under a certain homeless condition, but that also at the same time ensured that they could be in proximity to the streets where they picked the waste. So this was how I was trying to develop. This is what pushed me to develop a kind of a critique of the category of homelessness, essentially as a demand for the movement of the homeless, and it somehow blurs the necessary connection between their dwelling space and their workspace. So my aim was to now delve deeper into the layered spatiality of these dwellings, an issue that remains largely silent in the existing works that I found at that time. So let me share with you some stories of the women waste pickers in the Baliganj and Goriahat area. These are the two areas where I primarily worked in. And I conducted some field research in the Baliganj Goriahat area, which was part of ward number 68 of the Calcutta Corporation. Among the people who live under the Bijan Setu and the Goriahat flyover. So these two locations. One was the below the Bijan Setu, the people who were living there, and one is under the Goriahat flyover. The infrastructure of a bridge and a flyover, I noticed, created spaces underneath that had become shelter for the pavement dwellers. Now, this arrangement is viable because it did not infringe on the movement of automobiles and pedestrians' right of passage. For this paper, I would mention a few important points from my conversation with the women waste pickers living in these areas, primarily focusing on one particular family living under the Bijan Setu. A space is created under the Bijan Setu where two parallel roads end up in a U-turn blockade where there is a pay and use municipal toilet. Many of you must know it's not very far from your college also, and whoever has visited the Baliganj Goriahat area, there is a U-turn which is a blind blockage there. And we take that U-turn and we have to take another left to go to the Baliganj station, and if we go to the right, the Goriahat crossing comes. So in that U-turn, on the left, there is a pay and use toilet. A space is created there, and adjacent to the toilet, there are two floors beneath the bridge, which are usually rented to shopkeepers. Although most of the shops remain closed, as it does not make much economic sense for the shopkeeper to get a shop rented where pedestrians scarcely pass. So pedestrians do not enter that small by lane beyond that U-turn. We usually take a U-turn and go either towards Goriahat or towards the Baliganj station, but just right there is a small by-lane. If you notice, if some of you visit that area next, there are some shops, there are some street food shops there, and just beside that there is a by-lane, which is the dwelling space that I was closely looking at. There is no neighborhood of sedentary residents in that particular area. So the waste pickers living on this part, mostly women, make use of the shaded frontage of the locked shops. Now they annex these spaces with pieces of tarpaulin sheet, build a notion of privacy, use these spaces as the extension of the inner spaces inside the bridge, just below the bridge. None of the waste pickers I encountered in this particular area were new migrants to the city. All have been living here for the last 2 or 3 generations. The particular area annexed to the Baliganj station is well placed in the geography of rural-urban migration in Calcutta. A resident of Baliganj in 1940s, K.C. Roy Chaudhuri, who was also a legislative assembly member, he once wrote in his testimony to the Famine Commission of 1944 how thousands of destitute refugees invaded Baliganj in June 1943 from the villages south and southeast of Calcutta in search of food. Roy Chaudhuri continued, a large number of them took refuge to footpaths of roads leading to Baliganj and Thakuria stations. My principal interlocutor during my fieldwork, Tuktuki Mondol, took me under the flyover. Now, Tuktuki is the third generation of a rag picker pavement dweller unit with a strong maternal connection. She lives with her mother and maternal grandmother. Tuktuki still lives with her mother and maternal grandmother, but she has 2 children now. who are the only Muslim family in this particular area among the largely low caste Hindu population. Her grandmother, Gul Bahari, must be in her early 70s when I was doing this work, so she must be approaching 80s. Now Gul Bahari is still alive, but she's very old and feeble now. She couldn't mention the exact year of her permanent migration to the city from East Mollikpur village near Lokhikantapur in South 24 Parganas. But she used to recall when she spoke to me the time as Nakshaleর সময় when she first arrived. So I kind of assumed that it was probably around late 1960s, early 1970s. One may recollect that when I was talking about the surveys, which were also conducted during 74, during 86, that also mentioned the southern part of 24 Parganas as one of the major hubs of migration. So Tuktuki's grandmother also came from the South 24 Parganas. Now the only memory she had is a near permanent state of hunger under extreme poverty in the village. Her husband used to be a feriwala, an itinerant vendor in the village when she got married. In a few months, he married another woman and came to Calcutta. Gulbahari vaguely knows that he worked as a cart puller and stayed with another family somewhere near Taligarh. She did not have any other information about her husband. He used to go back to the village once in every 6-7 years, only to gift her with a child. There was hardly any remittance from the city to the village that could check the pace of dispossession for the family. It was in the persuasion of the ailing father-in-law that Gulbahari came to the city along with two of her daughters and a son. Now, one of her daughters is Tuktuki's mother. She initially worked as domestic help in 9 households with a monthly income of 180 rupees. After a few months, she drifted to rag picking. Gulbahari's daughter Putul, who is Tuktuki's mother, accompanied her since she was a child. From the age of 12, Putul started picking waste on her own. Gulbahari used to pick waste with a group of women who came from different villages along the rail track running between Shialda and Lokhikantapur, suggesting strong pre-existing village networks in the territorialization of this vocation. Shobi Sardar, in her late 60s, also living in that area under Bijan Setu, migrated around the same time as Gulbahari from Dokhin Barasat, also from South 24 Parganas, with her children unable to bear hunger coupled with the torture of her husband. Shobita Sardar, 40, lived under the Goriahat flyover, came with her mother and 5 siblings to the Waliganj area in 1980 after her father disappeared from their village in Gujarat. Pinky Haldar of Goriahat has a similar story to tell. It is quite conspicuous to know that a large number of women rag pickers, pavement dwellers, in this area migrated with their mothers under different circumstances. Many of them begged for a while or worked as domestic help and gradually shifted to rag picking. The waste pickers of adjacent areas have an informal understanding regarding their territorial jurisdictions of picking. This part was some of them explained to me. It was a very complex kind of a negotiation that they had between themselves. So they said, we hardly fight. Rather, we negotiate beforehand and settle who will cover what areas, says both Putul of Baliganj and Shobita of Goriahat. The women of Baliganj pick along the stretches of Baliganj-Goriahat Road and Rashbihari Avenue. Until a few years back, Putul used to walk along the neighborhoods in the alleys and by lanes before the break of dawn. But after the corporation people started collecting garbage from homes, neighborhoods have sadly become cleaner. Nowadays, Putul claimed, they have shifted from the residential areas to the main thoroughfares. Each day, they cover around 5 to 6 kilometers. Now, as we all know, with our middle class sensibilities, we all quite welcomed this initiation by the corporation, by the municipalities of starting this collecting of garbage from individual homes, and it definitely made the neighborhoods much more cleaner. These people had a very different way of looking at it because their livelihood depended on these unclean neighborhoods. So now they had to shift their patterns of work, their areas of work. That's what they said. So I asked Gulbahari, the eldest in this area, why she preferred rag picking over domestic help. She spoke of a kind of freedom, স্বাধীনতা. This is the word they used. অনেক স্বাধীন ছিলাম. Freedom of work that attracted her to rag picking. Generations of rag pickers staying in these areas I spoke to harped on this point. They were all in a minor way boasting about flexibility in arranging their 24 hours. The Baliganj women usually set off for their day's work at around 3 or 4 in the morning and come back before the sweepers arrive on the roads. Major streets and intersections are always the most lucrative stretches because of the shops and the cars. They said that the more cars on the street, the more bottles we collect because people usually like discard their bottles away from their cars on the streets. But women of Goriahat collect all night and get back by 4. So they have two different time schedules as well. And that's also part of this like negotiation that they do beforehand, as they told me. They start their work very early, within a few hours after the shops close. This is the Goriahat women. And the shutters are down and roads get desolate. So around midnight or a little after that. The sooner we collect the litters from the shop fronts, the fresher the things are. And fresher and cleaner looking scrap fetches more money than the soiled ones. Pinky explains, who lives in Goriahat. So like these were perspectives that were very of course very new to me as a researcher, but it was also many apparently very contradictory things that we have in our mind that we assume to be the right way of looking at things, like clean garbage. I was very surprised by how the way garbage was being described as clean and unclean by the waste picking women. Whereas we would usually think it as a misnomer. But these kind of perspectives were opening up. The segregation is done at their place of dwelling. They said we can do the segregation any time of the day along with cooking and looking after the children. It is this kind of a work time arrangement that seems to have made rag picking a largely female-dominated sector. The self-employment in the waste picking sector relieves these women from the regimentation of daytime in the domestic help sector. It is worth noting that what they call freedom, essentially we could think that it presupposes that their work is intimately tied to their space of dwelling. What they meant as freedom, which is in itself surprising, that in such a precarious situation, under such abject poverty, these people could also think of having a choice and think of having one precarious work would possibly give them more freedom than another even more precarious work. So these, I'm just flagging these because these are the unforeseen observations that I could locate while having conversations with these women. Now, my encounter with these people revealed abject conditions under which they worked. They often get wounded, infected while sorting and picking from all kinds of wastes with bare hands. Monsoons are always the worst time for them. It is hard to sell drenched papers, they complained. During heavy rains, they usually sit on some elevated place and wait until the water recedes. However, defying all difficulties, many women like Gulbahari have stayed back in the pavements along with their daughters and granddaughters for the last few decades. They use the pay and use toilet now at the standard rates. No wonder this is the case when public infrastructure is created to sanitize the city under private management. Now, one reason for them to stick to this particular area for decades, not only for a few years, but for decades, is that this is close to their area of scavenging. Their work starts at very early hours when no train would take them to their area of work. We know that like a huge percentage of domestic help in Calcutta, in the districts and suburbs, the domestic workers, they all commute by train. But this particular kind of work demands such a work time and becoming active at such an hour that it is always advantageous if they live near their area of scavenging. So this is a point of major difference with the women commuting by train from the suburban areas to participate in the booming lower rung of the informal care industry, such as domestic help in the middle class households. Uh, Also, the second phase of the work, sorting and segregating the collected scraps, is carried out in the places where they live. So the dwelling space is also significant from this aspect. They scavenge they collect the waste and then they bring it to the area where they live, and there the segregation happens. So it's basically a blurring boundary between their home and their workspace, because where they live, there the garbage, the big sacks of garbage are piled up, that the segregation is done. In between, they are looking after their children, they're cooking. So this is kind of an entangled livelihood that they have built up there. The collected scraps are piled in front of their dwellings. Then every object is sorted. Plastics of various kinds, glass, aluminium foil, metals, clothes, etc. and put in separate sacks. Discarded waste turns into recyclable and saleable waste only after it undergoes this process of segregation. Thus, the waste pickers try to stick to their location of dwelling amidst the threat of eviction or natural calamities like flood, rain, and extreme weather conditions. The women living in the Baligan station Bijan Setu area have a little more space to store these sacks, so they can afford to sell their objects once in a week. But the women living under Guriahat flyover usually sell them daily or every alternate day. Here, the parked cars shrink the spaces for keeping the snacks. If you visit the Guriahat flyover area, we all know that all the cars are parked just below the flyover. And that is also the space where these waste pickers stay. But they hardly get much space to store their sacks. So these are very tiny but very, very important details that impact their ways of work, the significance of their dwelling and the connection with their work patterns. So after segregation, and as I said that that is a blind lane where we hardly visit. That's a lane which is a blind lane under the Bijan Setu where the waste pickers live. So that has given them a certain advantage over the Guriahat women, because there is enough space, and since cars and people don't dwell in that space, that is not a thoroughfare, they have a little more space to stack their sacks. So after segregation, they carry the sacks to a nearby scrap dealer, usually a fixed one, who form the lowest rung of the chain of intermediary traders in the recycling industry. These shops are usually known among the waste pickers as Kabari Dukan, scrap dealers, Kach Loha Dukan, glass iron dealers, or Kagoj Dukan, waste paper dealers. Different objects accrue different rates. There are various categories of plastic. The transparent plastics in which garments are wrapped, known as PP, sells at rupees 20 per kg. These figures are from 2016. I'm sure they have changed now. If they are clean, they fetch 20 rupees. A little less if they are soiled. The bigger plastic bags sell for rupees 5 per kg. Mother dairy plastic containers of milk sells at rupees 12 per kg. Plastic bottles of mineral waters sell for rupees 10 per kg, but the bottle caps, the blue caps that are on the bottle, they sell at double price. Everyday fiber items and shoes fetch around rupees 10 per kg. All kinds of alcohol bottles sell at rupees 1 per kg, except beer, which is the only object that sells at rupees 1 per piece. The discarded perfume containers are expensive. They earn rupees 80 per kg. Aluminium foils and beer cans gathered mostly from the garbage bins of restaurants fetches rupees 40 per kg. Scrap tin is priced at 8. So when I spoke to these people, they could give me these vivid accounts of every single item that they segregate, that they club together, they weigh them, and how they sell it, and what each item meant to them. So they alerted me to the fact that people usually, we all know, we are all advised actually to destroy the water bottles after finishing them, so that they are not reused. So which is why they alerted me to the fact that you must have noticed that the caps of the bottle are harder plastic and they are difficult to destroy. So that fetches us more money. So these are the fascinating details which we hardly think about, even after we know that these are people living with us in our cities, uh, doing hapless and most unhealthy, most precarious jobs around us. And yet, when we talk to them, certain interesting details come out which surprises us. For the younger ones, the earnings vary between 100 to 200 a day. However, some of the women living in Goriahat earn little more, around rupees 800 a month, by cleaning the big shops at their opening hours. So they have taken these, since they are again closer to the big shops. Remember that the Bijan Shetu women do not have that advantage. Uh, they do, but lesser, at a lesser degree than the Goriahat women who are in proximity with the biggest shops, which is at the Goriahat crossing. My ethnography does not look into the details of the chain of traders in the waste recycling industry. That is also another fascinating kind of work, and there's a literature on that, like Kaveri Gill and some others have worked on this, like what is the relation between each actor in this vertical value chain of recycling industry, the waste pickers, the scrap dealers, the intermediaries, then the factory level. So I did not look at that part of it. I was mostly going to this area, talking with these people and trying to understand their everyday routines, their time management patterns, their work patterns, etc. So from these conversations, I could reach to some general findings, observations. Let me share some of these. One was the story of migration as narrated by the women I interviewed is predominantly an account of domestic or household loss, that the death of the earning husband or his desertion compelled the women to migrate to the city for a livelihood. That was a classic case of rural-urban migration, like led by dispossession of some kind. This account differs from the standard political economy and demographic arguments of rural-urban migration. Arguably, Gulbahari's husband was already an urban migrant, a non-peasant, who used to visit the village once in years. Now, secondly, we have seen that women's migration to the city followed a loose path of some kind of prior acquaintance with each other, in the sense that most of them migrated from the same area and ended up settling in particular pockets of the city. So if we go to the Bijan Shetu area and talk to the women, we kind of know that they either come from the same village or villages very close to each other, or as Gulbahari said, villages that stood on the railway track between Shialda and Lokhikantapu. So there was a kind of rural network that played out here. This means that migration was never a complete rupture from the past, or that of a new voyage to the unknown world. Though in some of their accounts, the unknown city and its structural anonymity predominate. Thirdly, most of my respondents agreed that waste picking was not their first occupation as they came to the city. Like, if you remember when we were discussing Gulbahari's story, she came first and became a domestic help. But then she quit that and opted for rag picking. And that is how the idea of freedom and my discussion around it came. So many of them, for a while, took recourse to begging. Subsequently, some of them switched to domestic labor sector, Both begging and domestic wage work must have enabled them to understand the intimate geographies of the neighborhoods and the local cartographies of power. That is, who had access to which neighborhood. For someone to become a waste picker, it was necessary to be known to the sedentary residents as someone who was not a complete outsider and was not a threat. For example, a potential thief to the neighborhood. Even the stray dogs needed to acknowledge them with silence. Therefore, regular begging and the experience of domestic work provided some of my respondents with the social and cultural resources that helped them to become waste pickers later. To the residents, on the other hand, this switch of livelihood occupation of my respondents represented their honesty, quote unquote honesty, that they did not choose to remain beggars. In short, then, I argue that to become a worker in the city is a historical process. Similarly, the life histories of my respondents show how difficult it was for them to establish legitimacy as domestic workers, as the potential employers always looked for a home address to track them. A constant allegation from the residents was that the pavement dwellers were too unclean to be worthy of cleaning work in their household. So these are like the layered kind of the layered in their perspective about the perception of the middle class towards these two differing occupations. So apart from freedom, it was also about the middle class households, the residents in that area, not wanting, how willing were they to accept these people entering their domestic spaces, and what the bodies of these women were considered as, how much cleanliness was a factor to become eligible as a domestic worker. Whereas for waste picking, it was rather the unclean body that was doing all this work, the unclean work done by the unclean body. But the moment you try to enter the household of a different class, immediately your attire, your body, the cleanliness, becomes a huge issue. Apart from the issue of trustworthiness, it's not only that this person is honest, but also how clean or unclean that person is. Fourth, the waste pickers I followed had enough reason to gradually move to such an occupation. As we have seen, this new occupation gave them a flexible time to look after their children, conduct everyday domestic work, and earn better remuneration. As opposed to domestic work that often entailed physical violence and humiliation, waste picking appeared to them to be, again, as they were describing, free of such hazards. It was a dirty job, they described. Often, it involved staying the better part of the day literally within a huge garbage bin, along with violent dogs and crows. The work involved instant segregation between rejectable wastes and recyclable wastes. The next step for them was to bring the piles of recyclable waste to the place they lived. Subsequently, they had to further segregate the accumulated waste into different heads, as we saw earlier. For each object would sell at a different price. The act of segregation was also an intensely household process. For here, the contribution from the children were crucial. In this entire process, the waste picker was seen to walk between the sites of collection and the place of segregation, which was ideally her home. So this act of segregation I was mentioning earlier also, this was kind of so entangled with their dwelling space, not only in terms of the space where they stacked their sacks, they segregated right there at a very little distance where the place where they cooked, the babies were sitting very near, and the little elderly kids helped them in doing the segregation. So it had become a kind of, after the street part of the work is completed, it kind of becomes this household work where all these women and their kids participate. And there is no spatial segregation after that. Which is why from the very beginning I was saying that my main object was to complicate this notion of homelessness, and that being the only desire of homeless people to have a home. We have to understand it with much more nuance. What does home mean to them? And could we separate their idea of home with their idea or with their necessities of their workspace, the access to their workspace? So is it just the lack of home? And if so, then why? Or how could we explain these families living for decades? So these kind of small details gave out the answer to that why. Let me now come to, as I said, my principal interlocutor was Tuktuki Montal. Tuktuki was not only responded to me. For these kind of works, we also have to remember that uh, it's often very difficult to get access to these areas. Tuktuki helped me with that a lot, and also after a point, Tuktuki helped me with the oral interviews. Like she spoke with the people. She wrote down some of them for me. Then I went and visited them. She accompanied me when I met to those people. So she was also very much part of that research. Tuktuki Mondal graduated from the Jogomaya Devi College in 2015. In the era of NGOization of development, Tuktuki also acts as a bridge between different NGO initiatives and the pavement dwellers. Tuktuki is an active member of Calcutta Navajagaran Morcha. Members like her are implicated to lead the process of co-opting others under various agendas. Demand for Annapurna Antoday cards, BPL cards, voter ID cards, claims for being considered worthy of the city's law and order regime, educational schemes for the street children, etc. Instead of entering into a wholesale critique of the NGO movement, I would rather like to discern the complex relationship implicated in the birth of such knowledge regimes and their subjects. Tuktuki's story is one of transition. Unlike her mother and grandmother, Tuktuki no longer works as a waste picker. Besides her college education and KNGM activism, she took up a job with an NGO. She used to teach at evening schools for street children. A few years back, she got married. This is, I'm saying, about 2016. It was around 2014 that she got married. Her husband also worked for this NGO. After their marriage, he came to the Baliganj railway station area to stay with Tuktuki. When I first met her, she was in her 4th month of pregnancy. Despite a few medical complications, she continued with her college and NGO work. In the final months, they rented a room in Koshpa, a nearby locality to Baliganj, with the desire of raising the child in a home and not the streets. However, while giving birth to her daughter, her condition deteriorated. She had to remain admitted at the hospital for quite a long time. Also, her husband had to stay with her. They overcame the crisis eventually and came back with their baby daughter. But meanwhile, both of them lost their jobs for staying on leave for a long duration. In a few months, they put up a tea stall and kochuri stall near the flyover and the station. They run this stall from early morning till noon. Tuktuki still has this stall. I often visit her when I go to Kolkata. And it's a very well located tea and kochuri stall. It's just beside the tram line that ends in that area. So they run this stall from early morning till noon. It has to be noted here that this rather quick shift in occupation was facilitated by the very location of their erstwhile dwelling. Baliganj is one of the most important rail stations which serve as a transit center between the uh, South 24 Parganas and Calcutta. The road towards the station, parallel to the bridge, gets busy with a thriving fruit and vegetable market quite early in the morning. The morning kochuri shop caters to the sellers and buyers at this morning market. Also, retailers and hawkers who open their shops around 10 to 11 in the morning eat at these places. Tuktuki and his husband had to pay 1,500 as rent for this small corner of the footpath where they set up the stall back in 2016. The rent must have increased by now. They have to mostly live under the bridge nowadays to stay near their shop. But they have retained their Poshka home, for which they have to pay a monthly rent of 3,000. Tuktuki's transition to a happy heterosexual family involved, among other things, the renting of a home in the city. She graduated to the mainstream of the city's host population by finding a place in the tenancy regime of the city. This was also a process of sanitizing her life on the street. In many of our conversations, Tuktuki attempted to distance herself from the usual women on the street. She mentioned that in various occasions, just being on the street at night was enough for the patrolling police to recognize her as a suspected prostitute. Now, Tuktuki's story highlights the complex dwelling economy in which a waste picker exists. In the literature on homelessness, misses the crucial economic and infrastructural dimensions of the space dwelling, of the space of dwelling of the urban poor. Living in the heart of the city ensures access to certain public infrastructures and economic activities. Apart from the proximity to workspace, the women living in this area could avail the advantages of an important railway station as a transit center and a thriving street market. Moreover, the station and the bridge itself provide shade, drinking water, public toilets, so their conditions of dwelling are structurally connected to the specificities of their occupation. How do we then otherwise explain the multi-generational living in a particular location on the street? Now, this argument becomes further corroborated by the fact that since this happened after I published the paper, this is not in the paper, but Tuktuki finally left that Koshba home because she couldn't manage child rearing and looking after the shop together. So in a year or so after around 2017, when I met her, she said, "Ki Didi, আমি ওই বাড়িটা ছেড়ে দিয়ে আবার বিজন সেতুর তলায় চলে এসেছি মা আর দিদিমার সঙ্গে থাকতে। I have left that Koshba home and I'm back in the Bijan Setu area now on the streets again. কারণ আমি যখন দোকান চালাই আমার মা দিদিমা আমার বাচ্চাটাকে দেখে." So particularly her grandmother, because by then she was very feeble and she didn't go for waste picking anymore. So she was taking care of Tuktuki's kid while she opened this shop. So Tuktuki kind of came back to the streets and left that home at Koshba. It was becoming expensive and also hazardous and distant from her place of work. And this looking after the child thing was very important for her. So their conditions of dwelling are structurally connected to the specificity of their occupation. How do we explain otherwise the multi-generational living in a particular location in the street? Living on the street has economic dimensions that mere recognition of a lack of home might fail to account for. Their continuing stay to that particular location in Baliganj emphasizes that housing activism needs to engage with homelessness in a different way. Housing the homeless cannot be pretext for their displacement to a new frontier of the city. I would like to end here and flag another point because it's, as I said, that it's quite an old paper and I'm like representing the older findings today in a changed circumstances. And now that all of us are talking of how we could sustain a movement for women to reclaim the night, for women to reclaim the street, I think it's kind of also important, and I would particularly urge the students to think about it. Think of the class dimension of this call, the Claim the Night call, the Claim the Streets call. What would this particular expression, claim the night, claim the street, mean to women like Gulbahar or Tuktuk or Putul? What do they mean for them? How do we then navigate the class question in our call for infrastructural change, for claiming the night for women, for making the city safer, for making the women freer? How do we negotiate the class question? How do we accommodate people like this? Is the call, does the call think about these women at all? Are they included in the imagination of a free city for women when we give that call? Could we think of Tuktuki and Putula also, who have who do continue to live on the streets. Streets are their space. Nights are their workplace. So I would urge the students to maybe think if you have if you can retain some of the points from this, you can think of it like that. So yeah, I'd like to end there.
Thank you, Dr. Bagchi, for this wonderful, engaging lecture. Thank you so much. I think we have a question and a comment here at the chat in the chat box. Uh, Tania Roy has written, "Thank you for such an informative presentation. I found it interesting as you mentioned how much cleanliness is required to be able to get inside the domestic realm. I would want you to reflect on the section of workers who are engaged in bathroom cleaning of the upper middle class household. Can we observe certain amount of flexibility in their entry inside the domestic household? Are the cleanliness norms by nature flexible? How do we negotiate the class question here?"
Yeah. Very important point. There have been many works on sanitation workers also, both historical work and ethnographic work. Look at them also. I'm not not an expert in that area, but this is if you're interested in this question, I would encourage you to look at also this question strictly from a caste angle. Caste is extremely important here. You know, Jamadar was not only a class category that existed for so long. If you remember, some old houses still have that. They had a separate staircase for the Jamadar in old houses, who entered only through that staircase, got access to the bathrooms, cleaned them, and got down through that staircase. Now things have changed now. The architectural patterns have changed. But we know that this is kind of the most marginal of the marginal informal work that exists among urban poor. There are there are of course no formal arrangement, but there is also extreme precarity and no particular pay arrangement for these kind of work. Uh, Now I live in Delhi. The caste question is even clearer here. So there are particular communities, the Ravidas communities, who are there is also an entanglement, which is why I say this is a very pertinent question. There's also an entanglement with people dwelling with waste and people cleaning our bathrooms. So both are seen together as the domain as of waste. So that Ravidas community, as I know, they do both these work. Some of between who are a little well off actually have households, others who are lesser in their economic status, they go down the roads and clean the. It's a very caste-driven occupation as well, along with the class question. I don't get what you say exactly by are the cleanliness norms by nature flexible, because I think they were exactly the opposite. They were so inflexible, they were so neatly organized around some tasks that we often do not see the caste question there. We only see it as a class question. But I think the class thing would be important. There's a major chunk of literature. If you're interested, then I can direct you to that.
Thank you, Dr. Bagchi, for the clarifications. I would request the participants to post questions or comments, if you have any, in the chat box, please. Any questions? Dr. Bagchi, I just wanted to know one thing. In 2020, if I'm not wrong, the South Asian Forum on the Environment, which is also known as SAFE, started a micro enterprise, and that was called the Resolve, Trash to Cash. And their main objective was to help change the radically unequal and hazardous situations of the women pickers. So has this kind of micro enterprises really helped to alter or change the situation of the women rack pickers especially?
Again, I can give you a kind of tentative idea of that, but not a very well fleshed out one, because I'm not involved in doing this project anymore. As far as I can remember, there were also such micro initiatives back then when I was also working, particularly in the cities of Bangalore and other metropolitan cities. Uh, there are pockets where these have ushered in certain changes, but it's a very complex geography and economy that has hindered it from becoming a large, hindered it from bringing about large scale changes, because it's a very complex discourse that goes on between the municipal and the corporation attempts of the beautification of the city, the way, because composting, garbage discarding, these are also not, most of the cities, these are not very successful projects. We see the garbage dumps in most of the cities and the mess they all are in. So it kind of, these are small pushes that create certain momentums. But then we can see that this waste picker network and this economy still thrives, because it always remains a kind of an incomplete pocketed initiatives rather than a very large, rather than bringing about very large changes. And which is also why I remember Gulbahari telling me this clean city initiative in Calcutta, after which we saw these automated vats coming up, these big blue gated systems. So she actually lamented that it's not that our jobs have gone. We still have to collect the scraps, because these are not extremely efficient systems. But what has come out is are villain. Now an alarm goes off if we try to enter that. When it was an open vat, we could enter freely. Now they have built a cage around it and the alarm goes off. So these are very little tiny changes that are brought about for the betterment of the garbage disposal industry, the compost industry. But these are, I would say, these are very pocketed initiatives and like very messy at the moment. But of course, there are many works being done in this area right now.
Thank you, Dr. Bagchi. Thank you so much for this very intriguing lecture. And it has captured in depth the lived experiences of the women rack pickers and pavement dwellers in Kolkata. The talk introduced novel ideas related to how the rack pickers perceived freedom, their story of migration, and identifying the different, the local cartographies of power. Of course, a very interesting idea of the clear garbage and how you conceived of space. And of course, last but not the least, the critique, your critique of the idea of homelessness and exploring what really home actually meant for the women rack pickers. So thank you so much, Dr. Bagchi. Thank you so much for such an interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank
Dr. Bagchi, one last question, I guess. I'll just read it out.
I think there is, I've read the question. I will just take 2 minutes to answer. This is again, thanks for this question. I didn't get the time to discuss the process of my field research and my ethnography. So this is a very important question for any ethnographer. And I was like, after doing my PhD, I'm trained in the discipline of history. So it was also doubly difficult for me to conceive how I should, like, going to a place, start asking people questions and then writing it down. Who am I in this whole process? Who are they? Who am I to consider them as my ready subjects? So this is a very important point to note. I would say if you are doing an ethnography, there are many, like, you have to go through the methodology literature a little bit. I cannot delve deep into that because it's a very rich literature on the methodology of ethnographic research and how the subject-object relationship could be determined in that. There are many fantastic work on that. Please look at that literature. In case of my work, I would just briefly want to say that it was really difficult. Like we often think that it also becomes kind of a poverty tourism for a people coming from our class at after a particular time. So it's kind of a question of ethics, morality, guilt that also troubles the ethnographer a lot. When I was going, I had no clue how I would approach that area, how I would enter that area. Why would these people talk to me even? Which is why, and they were already very jittery about any like a person who talks like myself, who dresses like this, who is clearly from a middle class, upper middle class background. They were already very jittery about for people coming there, randomly asking them questions, making them sit and wasting their time, because there were NGOs, journalists who were all the time bothering them. Which is why I said I kind of eventually like thought of this process of involving one of them as my interlocutor. So after a point, I did not ask the question. Tuktuki asked the questions for me. And she worked as the research assistant. I put her as like a formal research assistant for this program. She was paid, and she prepared the questionnaire because she was one among them. So she asked the questions. She gave me their and I kind of worked that out. So you can say that Tuktuki is as much a researcher for this paper as I am. Of course, she doesn't have the language, the resources, the cultural capital to reach publication or a journal, but this was my process. I'm just mentioning this because I navigated the question of subject-object relationship in this way, but you have to go through the very rich literature and see how many varied ways that ethnographers have dealt with this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Debarati ma'am. Thank you. And once again, thank you for the wonderful presentation.
So, thanks a lot for inviting.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.